Welcome back to the Disturbed Chronicles. My name's Cams, and I'm glad you're here because today's video we're going to talk about Florida and three of their most notorious serial killers. Florida has some of the most well-known serial killers in history, and they are number 3 on the list of states with the highest number of total victims. We all know Florida always has something crazy going on there, right? You see news article after news article about Florida man, Florida woman, and some of these serial killers I'm sure you've heard of before, like Ted Bundy, for example. Ted Bundy is very well known. I even studied him a little bit in my psychology class. And Ted has 20 confirmed victims, but it's suspected he killed over 30 women. Ted was originally from Vermont, but his mother Louise wasn't married when she got pregnant with Ted. And he was born in 1946, and at that time, it was frowned upon to have children outside of marriage. So Ted lived with his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor, and they raised Ted to believe that they were his biological mother and father. And his real mother was told to be his sister, and Ted was even called a bastard while growing up. Ted was said to have violent behavior when he was a child. His mother's younger sister actually reported waking up in her bed surrounded by kitchen knives, and Ted was just staring at her. Ted was only 3 years old when this happened. And it's also reported that Ted would hurt the neighborhood children. He would force them to strip and terrorize them, and you could hear them screaming all the time. Ted allegedly even hung his childhood cat from a clothesline and set it on fire. This is a huge sign of future problems when your child grows up if they display any kinds of abuse to animals or to people. Ted was arrested a few times in high school for car theft and burglary. And by 1968, he had dropped out of college. And he started working minimum wage jobs, and his partner, Diane Edwards, actually left him due to the report of him having a lack of maturity and ambition. Ted didn't find out about who his true parents were until he was about 23 years old. He never knew who his biological father was either, and this caused Ted to resent his mother his entire life. But things started to look up for him in about 1972 when he joined into the Republican Business Party. And he was even assigned an assistant to a chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. He even rekindled his relationship with Diane Edwards, and it's said that that's the only woman that he ever truly loved. And she was impressed by Ted's turnaround. Almost a year later, Ted would abruptly end their relationship without any reason. But it's reported that he wanted to reject her like she had previously rejected him. By this time, Ted has already dropped out of law school, and his earliest documented murders were in 1974, but it's suspected he had even started when he was a teenager. Ted Bundy was known for kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and torturing his victims. It's also said that he would pretend to have a disability or a physical injury in order to gain empathy from these potential victims and to get close to them. It's said that Ted had a type of woman that he looked for. He would look for very young women with long dark hair that was parted down the middle. And he killed several people in different states, not just in Florida. It's said that Ted Bundy started killing in 1969 all the way through 1978. Ted Bundy was in jail in Utah for an attempted kidnapping and assault from 1975. He tried to kidnap Carol Duranch after tricking her to get inside of his vehicle. Luckily, Carol escaped and she reported this to the police. A year later, Ted was convicted with a minimum of 1 year in prison. While he was incarcerated, the police found Ted Bundy guilty of a murder that happened shortly before his arrest in 1975. Ted Bundy killed 23-year-old Karen Campbell after kidnapping her from a ski resort where she was on vacation with her husband. Ted was charged with first-degree murder and was transferred from Utah to Colorado. At the time, it was allowed for Ted to assist in his defense on this trial, so the judge allowed him to visit the law library and agreed for him to freely roam without being shackled or handcuffed. this would be a mistake because on June 7th, 1977, Bundy escaped from prison by jumping out of a two-story window from the law library. He was free for almost a week before he was apprehended again, but just 6 months later, he would escape again. Apparently, Ted made himself lose weight by not eating as much, and he carved out a hole big enough for him to squeeze through out of his cell, and he climbed through the duckings and went into an apartment from the jail and fled. Ted had books and pillows placed in his bed to make it look like he was asleep in there. This is how Ted ends up in Tallahassee, Florida, after escaping from the prison. On January 15th, 1978, Ted entered the Chi Omega sorority house, which is very close to Florida State University. He then finds Margaret Elizabeth Bowman and he beats her with a piece of wood before choking her with a nylon stocking. Then he beats Lisa Janet Levy and he sexually assaults her with a hairspray bottle. Sadly, both of these women died and Ted wasn't done yet. He attacks two more women, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. These women would actually live to tell their story. This was described as a psychotic frenzy of murder. Shortly after these attacks, Ted breaks into another Florida State University apartment, Cheryl Thomas, and violently beats Cheryl, but luckily, Cheryl would survive this attack. Unfortunately, she did have permanent brain damage from this. He tried to attack a few other women, but he wasn't successful again until 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach, who Ted kidnaps, murders, and her body was found a few weeks later. This would be Ted's last known victim, and Ted was driving a stolen vehicle when police tried to stop him and he fled the scene. After a short chase, police apprehended Ted Bundy and it was discovered he was driving a Florida State University student's vehicle and he had some of their stolen credit cards. The surviving victims and the evidence left at the scene of his murders is what led to his ultimate conviction. These are not all of his murders and attacks. Ted Bundy has 11 victims in Washington. He has 8 victims in Utah, 3 in Colorado, 3 in Florida, 2 in Oregon, and 2 in Idaho, and also 1 in California. Not all of these are murders. Some of them are attacks or attempted murders. They are all victims, though. It's said that Ted may have more than 100 victims. Ted was offered a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, but he denied this and he was found guilty. Ted was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, and burglary. Ted was sentenced to death by electric chair, and he was executed on January 24th, 1989. Some of Ted's final words were to give his love to his family and friends. Ted Bundy needs a full video done on him because there's just so much you can say. I mean, we could talk about Ted for hours. They have several documentaries about Ted Bundy. You may have already watched some, but you can find those on Netflix, Prime, and HBO. Number 2 on this list is Eileen Wuornos. Now, you may have heard of her before. Eileen is said to have murdered 7 men within just a year. She was originally from Detroit, Michigan, and she had a very, very rough upbringing. Eileen's parents were very young when they had her and her brother Keith. Diane, Eileen's mother, divorced Eileen's father, Leo, just months before Eileen was born. Eileen's father, Leo, was sentenced to life in prison for the kidnapping and sexual assault of a 7-year-old girl. Leo was diagnosed with schizophrenia and he took his own life just after 2 years of being in prison. Diane, Eileen's mother, abandoned her and her brother Keith, which led to their grandparents taking over the 2 of them. Unfortunately, Eileen's grandparents were both alcoholics, and Eileen didn't have much guidance growing up. Eileen was said to have been subjected to sexual abuse from her grandfather, and she began engaging in sexual activities when she was just 11 years old to gain drugs, alcohol, and food from people. It's said that Eileen even had relations with her own brother, and Eileen became pregnant when she was just 14 after being sexually assaulted by a family friend. Eileen placed this child up for adoption, and shortly after, her grandmother died from liver failure. That is a common thing that happens whenever you are an alcoholic. Sometimes you experience liver issues. Eileen was kicked out of her grandparents' house after her grandmother died. She started soliciting herself because of this. At the age of 18, Eileen was arrested for a DUI and was charged with several other crimes. But Eileen never showed up in court. She was also charged with a failure to appear, and she fled to Florida from Colorado. Eileen met a 69-year-old man in Florida, and the two became married not long after meeting. Shortly after, her husband actually filed a restraining order against Eileen because she threatened to kill him and assaulted him with his own cane. Eileen was frequently starting fights at local bars, and she even did some jail time for an assault. So Eileen moves back to Michigan in 1976, and soon after, she's actually arrested for throwing a cue ball at a bartender. Now, if you don't know anything about what cue balls are from the game of pool, they are very heavy, and you do not want to get hit with one of those. In July of 1976, Eileen's brother Keith dies from cancer, and she actually receives a $10,000 payout from this. Eileen, of course, blew this money on luxurious items and, of course, drugs and alcohol. She tried to take her own life several times and even tried to shoot herself in the stomach. Just a few years later, Eileen was arrested for an armed robbery at a local gas station. She stole some cigarettes and $35 from the register. Eileen spent about a year in prison for this, and she was released in June of 1983. For the next couple years, Eileen frequently was arrested for theft, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and attempted robberies and assaults. Eileen was soliciting herself for money and even had a roommate named Tyra. This was actually said to be Eileen's lover, and the two were very close to each other. Eileen meets with an electronics store owner named Richard Mallory, and reported by Eileen, Richard drove the two of them to a secluded area to perform sexual services. Eileen said that Richard beat and he sodomized her, which she then acted in self-defense after shooting him several times. And it's reported that Richard did have a previous sexual assault on his record. Richard's body was discovered with several gunshot wounds to his lungs, and that's ultimately why he died. Richard was 51 years old, and this was Eileen's first known victim. Her second victim would be 6 months later, and in May of 1990, David Andrew Spears is actually reported missing. And on June 1st, his naked body was discovered on the side of the road with 6 gunshot wounds. David was 47 years old. Just a few days later, a rodeo worker named Charles Edmond was actually found dead on June 6th, 1990. His naked body was badly decomposed and he was wrapped in an electric blanket. It's reported he was killed on May 31st and he was shot 9 times. Eileen was caught driving Charles' vehicle, and she actually even pawned a gun that was in his name. Charles was 40 years old, and he was Eileen's third known victim. The fourth victim was a 65-year-old retired man named Peter Abraham Sims. He was last seen on June 7, 1990, after leaving his home in Jupiter, Florida to go visit his mother and some other family. Peter unfortunately never arrived and he was never seen again. His vehicle was found being abandoned by Eileen and her partner Tyra Moore. Eileen's fingerprints were found on the vehicle along with some broken glass after she wrecked the vehicle. The license plate was also missing. Unfortunately, Peter's body has never been found, and that's why Eileen was only charged with 6 murders instead of 7. On August 4th, a sausage salesman named Troy Eugene Barres was found dead with 2 gunshot wounds, and he was reported missing on July 31st, 1990. Troy was 50 years old, and he was Eileen's 5th victim. Eileen's 6th victim was Charles Richard Humphreys. Charles was a retired police officer, an Air Force major, and a child abuse investigator. Charles was found dead on September 12, 1990, and he had 6 gunshot wounds to his body and to his head. He was murdered on September 11th, and Charles was 56 years old at the time. Walter Gino Antonio would be Eileen's seventh and final victim. He was a trucker, an Army veteran, a volunteer fireman, and a security guard. Walter's partially naked body was found on November 19th near a logging area, and Walter had 4 gunshot wounds, and he was dead for less than 24 hours after he was found. His vehicle was found 5 days later in Brevard County, and Walter was 61 years old when he died. I'm actually from Brevard County. I was born and raised in Florida, so that kind of hits home a little bit. Eileen was arrested on January 1991 for a warrant, and the next day, her partner, Tyra Moore, was also arrested. Tyra agreed to provide a confession in exchange for immunity, and Tyra made several phone calls to Eileen in a fooling attempt to clear her name. On January 16, 1991, Eileen confessed to the murders, claiming self-defense and that all of these men tried to sexually assault her. In January of 1992, Eileen was convicted with the help of Tyra Moore's testifying. Eileen's defense stated that she was tested by psychiatrists, and they all claimed that Eileen was mentally unstable. She was diagnosed with BPD, borderline personality disorder, APD, antisocial personality disorder, as well. And Eileen confessed that only Richard tried to actually sexually assault her, and the other 6 men did not. She stood trial for all of these murders, and she gave inconsistent statements about the events. By February 1993, Eileen was given 6 death sentences for the murders of the 6 men, besides Peter, considering his body was never found. While she was incarcerated, Eileen stated that she killed those men in cold blood, and she robbed them, and she would do it again if she had the chance. She did not show any remorse, and Eileen did not request anything for her final meal, only a cup of coffee. Her last words were, "Yes, I would like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back. I'll be back." She was executed on October 9th, 2002, and several interviews actually show Eileen talking about these murders, and you can tell that she's got to be mentally unstable. It's a good thing that she will not be back. Regardless, it doesn't excuse any of her actions, mentally unstable or not. Number 3 on this list is Danny Rolling, aka the Gainesville Ripper. Danny has 8 victims, and he was originally from Louisiana. Danny had an abusive father named James, and James was a previous Korean War veteran and an ex-police officer. It's said that James was very violent to his son Danny and to his wife Claudia, and several reports state that James was physically abusive. This actually foreshadows future violence and rage from Danny. When Danny was younger, he got arrested several times for spying on women in dressing rooms and for several other robberies. Danny actually ended up joining the Air Force, and he was eventually discharged due to heavy drug use. It's said that Danny had used acid over 100 times. And although he left the Air Force, he did get married when he was 19, but just after 4 years, his wife leaves him because he threatened to kill her. It's said that Danny sexually assaulted women who resembled his ex-wife, and shortly after he got into a car accident which actually ended another woman's life. Danny was a tall man, standing at 6'2", and he was described as massive. He used that to his advantage. Danny committed several petty crimes like theft, armed robberies of convenience stores, and attempts to get cash. And Danny has a negative history with law enforcement within several states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and of course Florida. Danny would break free from jail several times, and he couldn't hold down a job. And his murders went unsolved for a very long time. Danny was known for posing his victims in provocative and degrading positions. He would take photos and even make it resemble like a horror movie scene. He used these bodies like props, and Danny actually inspired the 1996 Scream film that we all know and love, right? His first murders took place in Louisiana, where he murdered a family of 3. 24-year-old Julie Grissom, her father Tom Grissom, who was 55 years old, and her 8-year-old nephew, which is one of the youngest victims that we've ever spoke about on this channel. One time in May of 1990, Danny shot his father in his face due to an altercation after James told his son Danny to roll up his car windows because it was raining outside. Danny was abused by his father, so I believe that had a lot to do with his rage towards his father James in his later years. Fortunately for James, he actually survived his son's attack, but he did have permanent injuries to his eyes and his ear. Danny even tried to change his name to Michael and fled to Florida to start a new life, but this would only make things worse for Danny. On August 24th, 1990, Danny broke into the apartment of University of Florida students, 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell. He found Christina asleep on the couch, but he chose not to wake her up, and he then went upstairs and found Sonia sleeping in her bed. Danny taped Sonia's mouth shut, and then he killed her with a military knife. He then went downstairs to Christina, taped her mouth shut, and then Danny tied her up, cut off her clothes, and sexually assaulted her. He stabbed her several times, killing her, and then he proceeded to go upstairs and performed necrophilia on Sonia's dead body. It's reported that Danny also cut off their nipples and kept one of them as a trophy. Mutilation was one of his known things. Danny posed the two girls' corpses in provocative positions, took a shower, and then left the apartment. The very next day, on August 25th, 1990, Danny would break into Krista Hoyt's apartment. This, in my opinion, is the most violent murder that Danny committed. Krista wasn't home, so Danny waited in her apartment until she arrived, and then he subdued her by wrapping his arm around her throat, and then he tied her up, he sexually assaulted her, and then he stabbed her in her aorta, which is the largest artery in your body. Danny then cuts her from her pubic bone all the way up to her breastbone. He then leaves the apartment, and he went back to his campsite that was in the woods nearby the university. But Danny thinks that he may have left his wallet at Krista Hoyt's apartment. So he then goes back to Krista Hoyt's apartment and decides that he's going to decapitate her dead body. He poses her now headless corpse in a sitting position on her bed, and he puts her head on a shelf facing towards her dead body. This actually causes a lot of fear in the area and anyone that was actually attending this university. Many women transferred to different schools and they changed their daily routines because of this. 2 days later, on August 27th, 1990, Danny breaks into the apartment of Tracy Pauls and Manny Taboda. They were both 23 years old, and Danny found Manny first, and there was reported to be a little bit of a struggle. He then kills Manny by stabbing him several times. Tracy heard the commotion and she came to check on her friend Manny. She found Danny instead, and Danny then chases Tracy into her room where she tries to barricade herself in, but unfortunately Danny breaks through and he gets a hold of Tracy. He tapes her wrists and her mouth. He sexually assaults her, and then he stabs her 3 times in her back and poses her body, and then he leaves. There was no farther mutilation. He did not touch Manny's body after he was killed, and it's said that he may have ran out of time during this attack. The college actually shut down all classes for at least a week, and the students armed themselves with weapons. Danny was very good at not leaving any traces or evidence behind, and he would even use cleaning agents to cover up his tracks. The police couldn't figure out who was responsible for these attacks on the campus. One of the college students named Edward Humphrey actually got arrested on suspicion of him being responsible for Danny's murders. Edward had a history of mental health issues, and he even was recently in trouble for an attack on his own grandmother. But after 5 months of Edward being in jail, he was released due to a lack of evidence. And Danny continued to rob homes and gas stations without being suspected at all for these murders, until September 7th, 1990, when he was arrested for a robbery at a supermarket in Ocala, Florida. And he had a friend named Cindy who actually calls Crime Stoppers and reports that Danny may be responsible for these murders in Florida. Cindy had spent some one-on-one time with Danny after inviting her to her home with her husband. Danny would come over and he would say, very questionable, dark things that raised flags for this couple. He even stated that he liked to stick his knife into people. The two decided that Danny shouldn't come over anymore, and Cindy even recalled Danny saying that he wanted to go somewhere that was warm and that had beautiful women. She felt that these Florida murders weren't just a coincidence, and the police had discovered his abandoned campsite in the woods nearby the campus, and they actually found an audio recording along with a duffel bag with some stained up money in it and a screwdriver that he used to break into women's apartments. They never listened to this recording for some reason, and had they listened to it sooner, they would have caught him months ago, and the police even admitted to that. These recordings were of Danny actually saying his full name, calling himself a murderer, and basically telling on himself. But Danny was already in jail, so they didn't have to do much searching for him. They looked up Danny's record, and they saw that he was responsible for many robberies and theft. And in January of 1991, the police finally figured out that the Louisiana family that was murdered resembled the Gainesville murders, and they actually matched Danny's DNA with the DNA found at the scene of the Louisiana murders, which is where Danny's first documented murders happened. And in November of 1991, Danny was charged with 5 counts of murder. Danny pleaded guilty to all the murders and then stated his motive was to be like the superstar Ted Bundy. About 4 years after the murders on April 20th, 1994, Danny was sentenced to death. He was mentally unstable considering his childhood trauma. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and paraphilia. Danny actually handwrote an apology, and he did feel some remorse for these murders. On October 25th, 2006, Danny was executed by lethal injection. He requested lobster tail as his last meal, and he didn't speak any final words, but he did sing a gospel song. Danny was 52 when he was executed, and I actually did a full video on Danny previously, so if you want to know any more about him, you should make sure to check that out. Florida is a beautiful place, but it's also known to be a very dangerous one. So that's all I got for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you guys for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on the next disturbing video.